Hello, you're watching Sky News Breakfast. Thanks for being with us. The Ukrainian president has delivered a wartime message of defiance and thanks in an address to the US Congress overnight. Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington was his first time abroad since Russia invaded Ukraine back in February. The US President, Joe Biden, has promised Zelensky billions more dollars in aid, as well as a Patriot missile system. Our US correspondent, James Matthews, has our top story.
President of Ukraine.
It was rock star stuff. They acclaimed the president dressed in khaki. Fresh from the war zone to the well of the House chamber with an assessment from the front line.
Ukraine is alive and kicking.
He might not have spotted the Republicans who sat when everyone else stood, but he did address concerns over US aid to Ukraine.
Thank you.
It wasn't charity, he said, but an investment for his country and for theirs. He spoke of a turning point in 2023.
Next year will be a turning point. I know it. The point when Ukrainian courage and American resolve of our common freedom.
Earlier in the day at the White House, there had been a comforting hand from the president and a handout.
You are the man of the year.
To the Ukrainian he hailed as US Man of the Year, the US president pledged a Patriot missile defense system.
We're going to continue to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend itself, particularly air defense, and that's why we're going to be providing Ukraine with Patriot missile battery.
Zelensky's first foreign trip since conflict began took place amidst the tightest security. It began in darkness at the Polish border and continued in a US military plane under escort by NATO jets. The reassurance he received here of continued support will matter to President Zelensky. What will matter more is the pledge of military hardware he takes home, specifically Patriot missiles, a defensive shield as Russia targets his country's infrastructure from the air. Zelensky isn't the first wartime leader in wartime to address a joint session of Congress. Winston Churchill came before him in 1941 during the Second World War. There was no handover of a battlefield flag in his day. The choreography might have changed in 81 years, but warnings of tyranny remain the same. James Matthews, Sky News, Washington.
Let's go to Ukraine now and bring in our international affairs editor, Dominic Wackhorn, who is in Odessa for us. Good morning to you, Dominic. So a huge moment last night in Congress as Zelensky addressed Congress people, and that promise of money and, of course, that missile system will be well received.
Yes, but not enough, I think, is what Ukrainians will feel here. And I think they are frustrated that people in the West haven't really quite got the measure of what's happening here and what could happen over the winter. We went to the town of Bakhmut, which is where the fiercest battle in this war is being waged now. It's a town where the Russians have made considerable advances despite Ukrainian resistance. They control high ground, some of the high ground around the city. So we had to drive in fast on back roads to avoid the threat of artillery fire on our vehicles. And once you get into the town, you hear this regular, constant sound of shelling nearby. So a clear sense, we weren't that far from the front line of the battle that's raging there. We met some Chechen fighters who are hard to get to film, but they invited us to their secret bunker there. And their insights into this war, I think, were very revealing and worth listening to in the West. And what they say is the Russians are using the tactics they've been using against enemies like the Chechens since the 90s, the age-old Russian tactics of using quantity over quality. A lot of conscripts coming in wave after wave in Bakhmut. They're not well trained, they're not well armed, they're not very motivated. They're being ordered from the rear, but they're being sent in such waves that despite the Ukrainian resistance, the spirit of the fighters and the weapons that are being given by the West, they are grindingly making their way into the city. And that's what the Ukrainians are up against. They're undoubtedly brave, determined and spirited, but they need more weapons. They need more advanced weapons, they say, because the Russians are now doubling down on this. We heard Putin yesterday say that he wants to expand the army to 1.5 million soldiers. So he's going to use this sort of human wave strategy to try and ground down the Ukrainians. And what they're saying here is they need more weapons to see that off. The other thing that's very clear from here, when you drive through the cities here, that one after another are plunged into darkness, is that the West is not doing enough to repel the threat of the Russians degrading Ukrainians' power grids here. And that is a mortal danger to Ukrainians. It could risk many of them dying, freezing to death in their homes over winter. And you get a sense it's cold now, but it's going to get much colder here. When you drive through these cities, which are plunged into darkness, if that continues, it's going to kill Ukrainians, but it's also going to sap the morale and fighting spirit of Ukrainians fighting on the front. And the West has got to do more to repel that threat. And frankly, Ukrainians say that the Patriot battery they've been asking for months, which they're finally getting, won't be enough. And it's not very good at taking out the kind of cheaper, plentiful drones that the Russians are sending against them that they're buying from Iran. So more needs to be done. I think they'll be buoyed by the kind of reception that their president's had in Washington, but they will, I think, be frustrated that they're still not getting enough. I'm very worried by what President Biden said when he was asked why not more advanced weaponry was being given to the Ukrainians. And he said he's having to weigh up the Ukrainians' military needs with the need to keep the alliance united. And I think that will be music to Putin's ears, the president articulating there that there are still divisions in the alliance about what kind of weapons the Ukrainians can be given.
OK, Dominic, for now, thank you very much. Now, back here, and the disruption is far from over, is the warning this morning from health leaders after yesterday's strike by ambulance staff. NHS providers says that the knock-on effects are likely to mean some challenging days ahead for stretched services. And as unions and ministers remain locked in stalemate over pay negotiations, it's being reported that the government could try and speed up an NHS pay deal next year. Shingi Marike reports.
Called to the front line of a crisis, but not the kind you'd usually associate them with. Members of the military responding to ambulance call-outs to plug the gaps left by staff on the picket line.
What do we want? Say stop it! When do we want it? Now!
Thousands of call handlers, paramedics, technicians and more out in force and with the support of these people at least.
When do we want it? Now!
They've got to do what they've got to do, haven't they? Do you know what I mean? They're doing a good job. It's not easy. They put up with all types of stuff going on, abuse and everything. But the money is no good. It's no good.
If a footballer can earn what they can earn, I'll look at it that they can earn a lot, not a lot more, but earn double than what they're earning now.
With the London Ambulance Service, one of those was staff on strike yesterday. The vehicles you can see behind me were left providing what's been described as life and limb cover, responding to only the most serious emergency calls. That's part of a pay dispute with very real consequences for the public and another strike date to come next week. NHS leaders have warned the disruption to care will continue. 999 calls in parts of the country were down, suggesting some people chose to stay away, potentially making their conditions worse. Here at this care home in Bristol, there was an emergency call for a resident who thought they might be having a heart attack.
The operator, because of the strikes, she said that we needed to use the defibrillator from the local pub. Unfortunately, we can't just go and get that. We have to contact the local pub first to say that we need it. Then they said we then just contact the GP. So that's what we've done. So it wasn't a heart attack, thankfully, but, you know, it puts you in that position. What if it was?
That incident could have been much worse. The government and unions failing to get round the table could be fatal for some. Headlines today suggest ministers are thinking about pay recommendations for next year.
When do we want it? Now!
With more strike action planned for next week, people will be hoping all parties can take the heat away from this industrial dispute, because deadlocks involving an already stretched health service are the ones that will hurt the most. Shingi Marike, Sky News, Royal London Hospital.
All right, let's bring in Becky Cottrell, who's outside St Thomas's Hospital in central London for us right now. Good morning again to you, Becky. So what's the situation there now?
Well, I think really all eyes within the health service here and throughout the country will be on A&E departments today and in the coming days. As you heard in Shingi's report then, calls to ambulances, 999 calls, were down yesterday, and that is likely because people who did need care heeded those warnings to only call for an ambulance if your life was at risk. But that doesn't mean that those people don't need medical attention, and the concern is that their conditions may have deteriorated because they didn't get that care when they should have done. It's not just the fallout from the ambulance strikes, though, that the health service and patients are dealing with. It's also the nurses' strikes, one earlier this week week and also one last week. And we know that for this week's strike alone, there were almost 13,800 appointments cancelled or rescheduled. And that is adding to this big backlog of procedures that built up throughout the pandemic. Now, unions and striking staff would say, well, that backlog, wait times, including in emergency care, they were all building up anyway because so many staff are leaving the health service because of pay and working conditions, and that is why they are now having to strike. But I think particularly in terms of the fallout from yesterday's ambulance strike, the focus and the concern will be on patients showing up at A&E departments critically ill because they didn't get the care they needed yesterday.
Becky, thank you for now. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Ali Fatescu, who's joining us for more on this. So, Ali, where are we with negotiations between the unions and the government right now?
Well, the government have been accused of taking a hard line. It has felt this week like the prospect of a deal between the government and the unions has been vanishing into the distance. Certainly, I think we've seen a hardening of the rhetoric from both sides. But the front page of The Telegraph this morning talking about a new deal when it comes to NHS workers. My understanding from the conversations that I've had is that there's no prospect of a kind of immediate new deal that would solve the problem of strike action right now, but the Health Secretary is very keen to make the process of making recommendations with the pay review body that sets pay for public sector pay next year happen as quickly as possible. Ordinarily, they are meant to set pay in about April. That process has been delayed in previous years. There is a desire from the Health Secretary to look forward to make sure that that process happens as quickly as possible. But this is not a sort of last-minute Christmas miracle that will stop the strikes from happening. It will not avert the prospect of ambulance strikes next week, more nurses' strikes expected next year. So, of course, both sides saying that the other needs to budge, and the problem for the Prime Minister is that this is starting to reflect not just on the Health Secretary, but on him too. Accusations that he hasn't been seen, that he's shirking responsibility. Others will say he's trying to not look weak and talk tough on the unions. It is an uncomfortable dynamic, the government being pitted against workers as public sympathy starts to wane. I think there is a potential for the blame to end up at the government's feet for this, but I think it is fair to say that there is no sign of a deal that is going to have an immediate impact today, and that means that more strike action looms, and that's going to have an impact on everyone.
It certainly is. OK, Ali, for now, thank you. And just to let you know that later this hour we'll be speaking to the interim chief executive of NHS providers, Saffron Caudry. That is at 7:30. Now, NHS strikes are just part of a wave of industrial action that's taking place this month. The RMT rail union is going to stage another walkout from Christmas Eve until the morning of December the 27th. There are currently no further nursing strikes planned after their walkout earlier this week. Ambulance workers will be on strike on the 28th of December. Royal Mail workers will be back on the picket line tomorrow and on Saturday, Christmas Eve. Border Force staff are going to walk off the job from tomorrow to the 26th and then again from the 28th to the 31st. And workers from National Highways are also striking today. They're members of the Public and Commercial Services Union in London and South East England will be off work until Christmas Day, then in the West Midlands and South West on the 31st and 30th. All right, let's return now to President Volodymyr Zelensky's first trip abroad since Russia invaded Ukraine. He's been to Washington, as we said, and has met with President Biden and spoken before Congress. Now, Sir Peter Westmacott is a former British ambassador to the United States and joins us now live. Sir Peter, good morning to you. Thank you very much for being with us on Sky News this morning. We'll get to some of the specifics of the details of the visit, but first, just give us a sense of the significance of him actually going there and speaking to Congress.
I think it's a very important moment. You remember when this terrible invasion of Ukraine began and the Americans offered a plane to get Zelensky out of Ukraine because their military, just like a lot of the military here and elsewhere, didn't think the Ukrainians were going to last more than a few days. And the response of Zelensky was, I don't need a trip, I need ammunition. So he's been very clear from the beginning that he needed foreign military support. And to their great credit, the Americans have given him something like $50 billion worth of support, much of that military, some of it financial, over the last 9 or 10 months, far, far more than anybody else has. And so to go to Washington when there was a little bit of a lull on the fighting, to make his case before Congress, and with that resonance which Dominic was mentioning of the way in which Winston Churchill went to Congress at Christmas in 1941, I think that's not lost on a lot of people, including Speaker Pelosi. I think optically and symbolically, it's a great time to go there. But on the material side, I think it's important too, because Congress is about to change hands, at least the House of Representatives is, and Republicans are going to take over the leadership. They will be harder to persuade to provide Ukraine with lots more assistance next year. So the fact that sometime the next day or two, we hope, there's going to be a vote for another $45 billion worth of support for Ukraine with this Congress is really important for Ukraine, because if it's this time next year, God forbid, it's not going to be quite as easy because there'll be different leadership on the Hill and there may be a degree of Ukraine fatigue setting in.
Yeah, and you say difficult to persuade. I mean, there are some commentators who think that perhaps President Zelensky should have gone in a couple of months' time when that new Congress is in. I mean, genuine concerns then are there, Sir Peter, that a new Congress might not give their full support to Ukraine and President Zelensky going forward?
I think in the Senate, it's okay. I was in Washington 10 days ago. I spoke to Republicans and to Democrats in the Senate, and there is still strong bipartisan support for America doing its bit to support Ukraine against this brutal, murderous invasion. The House is going to change hands. There will be Republican leadership. There are some wobbles there. Not entirely, but I think it's going to be a bit more difficult in the House of Representatives, if not in the Senate. So I think getting through the current defense appropriations bill, which has to be voted through in the next few days, is critical. And it's I think, in my view, good politics for Zelensky to be there at this time. Let's deal with the problems for the next Congress when that arises. But he desperately needs that military support now, the Patriots and other things, because we know what Putin is up to. He's trying to destroy the infrastructure, destroy the will of the Ukrainian people, and then issue completely unacceptable terms for some sort of armistice. And so Ukraine needs the support of its friends and allies to resist those efforts from Putin.
Let's come on to the Patriot battery system that's going to be sent then, Sir Peter. I mean, when Joe Biden talked about it, it did sound like he said Patriot battery singular. So is it just one system? Do we know yet? But that's not the only weapon system that's going to be sent, is it? There are more weapons being sent to help try and defend Ukrainian skies.
Well, Patriots come in truckloads of 4. I'm not a military expert, as you know. How many do you get for the 1.8 billion, which is firmly committed before the big vote coming up at the next day or two? I'm not sure. I think I heard Patriots in the plural, but of course, they're not all that they need. Patriots are expensive missiles which shoot down high-flying bombers and fighter aircraft. They're not a very efficient way of dealing with cheap and cheerful drones, which Putin has got from his friends in Iran. So they do need other military equipment to support themselves. And they need a lot of ammunition. They need more artillery. They need a whole lot of different bits of military equipment. There's no doubting the readiness and the willingness of the Ukrainian soldiers to fight, well trained, including by the British, by the way, over the last 8 or 9 years. They've defied expectations, but they do need more kit of a whole lot of different varieties.
And so, Peter, let me just expand this a little bit, if I can, then, and look at NATO support more broadly. I want you to see if you can put your former ambassador to Turkey hat on for a minute. Just how tricky is it managing the relationship right now between NATO and the largest military in NATO, Turkey, in terms of that grain deal with Erdogan in charge and also NATO's expansion?
Well, Kamali, you know Turkey as well. I know that you were posted in Istanbul some time back. Look, I think that President Erdogan is playing a pretty clever game in that he remains in touch with both sides. Turkey has no desire to see Russia take control of Ukraine and therefore of the Black Sea, which is, after all, its own backyard. And it's behaved pretty responsibly in denying access to the straits through the Bosphorus, through Istanbul, to Russian warships as a belligerent state, as the language goes. But, and also I should say that Turkey is providing some very useful drones to Ukraine. but it's doing quite well from the position of being in touch with both sides, not having sanctioned Russia. It has become an indispensable neighbor, and it may well play a role if there is to be, or when there is to be, some sort of a diplomatic conversation. But in the meantime, because it's not sanctioning Russia, masses of money is coming from Russia into the Turkish economy, which is one of the reasons why for the last few months, very unusually, the Turkish lira has remained stable rather than continued the free fall that we've seen over the last year or two. So Turkey's playing clever hand, doing quite well from the present situation, but has yet to play, I think, a potentially important role when the diplomacy comes into play.
And while I have you, Sir Peter, just a very last thought here, and this is off topic entirely of the war in Ukraine and about Israel and about the new administration that's been formed there. I mean, there are set leaders in key positions in the government now of Benjamin Netanyahu's new administration. Is any hope, even the Trump-Kushner deal, is that now completely over, do you think?
Well, I think the Abraham Accords are still there. Of course, they haven't yet got Saudi Arabia signing on to them, but that is a diplomatic achievement, a rather surprising one, because it wasn't quite what Jared Kushner was initially selling. But what I certainly have heard in Washington is some concern that a new Netanyahu government with some very hardline right-wing coalition partners may be more difficult in terms of Palestinian rights, which is something that's been relatively quiet for a while. And I know that there are some people in Washington who are nervous that Israel might become yet more hawkish about Iran, because, of course, President Trump tore up the nuclear deal that we had, which constrained Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. So I know that there are some foreign policy specialists in Washington who are looking with some concern about what's going to happen in Israel and the extent to which some of those hawks may try and drag America into a harder line, both on Palestinian issues and on dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat.
OK, Sir Peter Westmacott, really good to have your thoughts this morning. To appreciate your time and your patience. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, businesses say they feel like they're banging their heads against a brick wall over improving trade with the European Union. That's according to the British Chambers of Commerce, which says its members are still struggling with the UK's post-Brexit trading arrangements. Now, in a survey they carried out, it found that more than half of its members were finding it difficult to comply with new rules for exporting goods, while 45% reported problems with adapting to rules for trading services. And the vast majority, 77%, said the deal hadn't helped them increase sales. All right, let's start this section here with some breaking news that's come in the last couple of minutes. The UK economy had contracted by more than had been thought in the third quarter of this year. The latest figures that have come from the Office for National Statistics show that the fall in GDP was in fact 0.3%. We'll have more on those new GDP figures throughout the morning here on Sky News. Now, there could be more disruption in the new year with doctors in Wales who are considering strike action for the first time. The British Medical Association Welsh Council says it spoke to hospital doctors this month and found that almost two-thirds are in favour of some kind of industrial action. The union says the government needs to finally wake up to the crisis. And we were just saying with Sir Peter, Benjamin Netanyahu says he's formed a new coalition, allowing him to return to Israel's prime minister. He's leading the most right-wing government Israel has ever seen, dominated by far-right, ultra-Orthodox parties. The newly appointed security minister was once convicted of incitement to racism and of supporting a terror group. And gender reform legislation in Scotland is expected to pass in a final vote at Holyrood later after being delayed last night. The bill will lower to 16 the minimum age at which a person can legally change their gender. It was set to be voted on Wednesday, but long debates over amendments pushed the vote back to this afternoon. The former boss of the bankrupt crypto exchange, FTX, has been extradited to the United States to face criminal charges. Sam Bankman-Fried, who was arrested in the Bahamas, is likely to face a judge in New York today. Prosecutors say that two associates of Bankman-Fried have pleaded guilty to charges in cooperation for a deal. And the Brazilian football legend Pelé will remain in hospital over Christmas after doctors found that his cancer had advanced. The 82-year-old's been undergoing chemotherapy since having a tumour removed from his colon last year. And the King will continue the tradition of having a birthday parade in the summer. Trooping the Colour will be held on the 17th of June in central London. His actual birthday, as you know, is the 14th of November. The Queen Consort and other members of the royal family will be stepping up for ceremonial military roles. Hello and welcome back. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Let's return now to those strikes in the NHS and the warnings from health leaders that the disruption is far from over. I'm joined now by the interim chief executive of NHS providers, Saffron Cordery. Saffron Cordery, good morning to you and thank you so much for being with us. So NHS leaders saying the disruption is far from over. What are the next couple of days and weeks going to be like?
I think we're in for a challenging time over the next couple of days, because what we do know is after this kind of strike action or after something like a bank holiday in the NHS, we know that there is a lot of pent-up demand. So although yesterday with the ambulance service strikes, perhaps the demand was down, what we are going to see now is demand really rising. So I think emergency departments particularly are going to feel the strain in those areas where there were strikes, which for ambulance services was in every part of the country apart from the east of England. So some real pressure there, pent-up demand, and also the added pressure of rearranging all of those operations and appointments that needed to be postponed.
And what's that going to mean for patient safety?
I think we should be assured that trust leaders will do everything that they can to make sure that patients remain as safe as possible. So that will mean making sure that there are as many staff as possible in those emergency departments and making sure that those operations can be rearranged for as quickly as possible. So yeah, it's going to be a challenging time, but the one thing that's really important for the public and patients to understand is that trust leaders do everything in their power to make sure that patients are kept as safe as possible.
I mean, you mentioned it being sort of the bounce back after what was like a bank holiday, but you'll know anecdotally, many people who work in the NHS say staffing levels mean that every day is almost like a bank holiday because they are so understaffed. I mean, where does this get resolved at this point, do you think now?
I think you're absolutely right in terms of those fundamental levels of staff shortages, these structural issues that we talk about. Staff on the front line are significantly overstretched, and we need to see a real growth in the number of staff across the whole of the NHS. What we've got to see now is the government come to the table and have a serious discussion and negotiation about pay, because this dispute is about pay and it's also about working conditions and keeping patients safe.
And we know what they're going to say about pay. That's for the Independent Pay Review Board. But let's talk about the working conditions. I took a look at the NHS provider's website, and it says one of the missions is to build effective relationships with central government, key stakeholders in central government. Is there any feeling among NHS providers that that relationship has not been working functionally after all this time, that we've reached this point?
No, I don't think that's fair to say. Our role is to make sure that the government understands the impact of its policies and seek to encourage it to improve those policies in the interests of the NHS and the patients that it's there to treat. So I wouldn't say that they've broken down in any way. We're there to really, nudge them and keep them going and focused on the task in hand. So we will continue to do that. And I think that after the significant disruption we saw last week and this week, and we're going to see next week with the ambulance strike again, and the possibility of strikes being announced in the new year, I think what we've got to do is make sure that we stay completely focused on making sure that the government understands the importance of coming to the table and understands the importance of making sure that we're in a situation where we can boost the level of staffing across the NHS, and also make sure that frontline staff get the pay terms and conditions they deserve.
And I'm not trying to be unfair, Saffron, as you'll understand, but I do wonder, you say nudge them. I wonder if all sides in this need a bit more of a shove.
Yes, perhaps my choice of language there wasn't. Yeah, it's absolutely about being very clear about the impact of what is going on at the moment, where that's come from, and what we actually need to do in future to make sure that we have adequate staffing across the NHS. We know that there are 130,000, well, more than 130,000 vacancies in the NHS. We know that we are hemorrhaging staff because of pay and working conditions, particularly in more junior bands of NHS staff. So we really have to do something about that. And it's not just about the NHS. The government knows we need to do something about social care as well, because social care is really on its knees and it needs a boost. And if social care has a boost and the NHS frontline staff have the terms and conditions they need, then we will see an effective NHS.
Yeah, and it comes down to funding again, doesn't it? I mean, the Health Secretary yesterday was talking about extra funding to improve outcomes and treatments, but without having a staff to carry out those treatments and services, you're not going to be able to have a functioning service. I mean, how much more money does social care need to get it functioning, to then help the health care sector?
I think social care needs a very significant cash injection, and it needs also some structural funding support over a significant period of time. The way that social care is funded is very much, there's a central funding pot, but then is also social care is funded through local council tax. So it's up to the discretion of local councils as to how high they set their what's called the social care precept. So it's a very variable funding source. So I think we need to see some significant focus on that to make sure that it's sustainable and fit for purpose. And we know that local government has struggled over the years with funding that has been depleted by up to 60% over the last 10 years or so. So that's very, very difficult to run the high level of services that they need to run to support social care in children, in adults, in vulnerable adults and older people. And that's a tough task for them.
Yeah, and finally then, and Saffron Quadri, with all that we're facing in the health service, how worried are you about how it's going to fare through this winter?
We've known even before the industrial action, we knew that we were in for a tough time. NHS frontline staff are incredibly ingenious. They are incredibly creative, innovative. Trust leaders will be doing all that they can to put plans in place. And we know that they work very closely with NHS England and others to do that. But it's going to be hard. Demand is very high. Staffing levels aren't where they should be. And we know that we've got flu, which is causing rising levels of hospitalizations. We've got mental health waiting lists, which is going through the roof. We've got COVID coming back now, and we've just had a really cold snap. So if we have another one of those, that's going to add into the pot. So we are seeing a really tough situation here. I mean, NHS staff will do everything they can to get through this and to support patients and to provide as safer care as possible. But we know it's going to be tough.
OK, Saffron Quadri, Interim Chief Exec of NHS Providers, do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, let's take a look at the weather now, because we're getting a clearer picture of how it's going to look in time for Christmas after an increase in temperatures at the start of this week. Let's bring in Kirsty McCabe, our meteorologist, for some more on this. So, Kirsty, how are the next couple of days looking weather-wise?
Morning, Kamali. It's looking very unsettled, actually, for most of us. Much milder than it was. A bit of a disappointment, I have to say, after that cold snap. I think many people had hoped for a white Christmas, not looking so likely now. And if you're interested, a white Christmas officially is when a single flake of snow is observed falling from the sky during the 24 hours of Christmas Day. Now, there's, of course, a chance that will happen somewhere, most likely the northwest of Scotland. And we will see colder air coming in later on Christmas. But that idea of a blanket of snow on the ground, well, that's not looking likely this Christmas. But let's take a look at what's happening in the run-up.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It is going to be quite mild and changeable then. Some wet conditions in the run-up to Christmas. Colder weather returning from the north, though, Christmas Day evening into Boxing Day. Bit of a murky grey start this morning. There's some fog patches around across parts of England and Wales, and Ireland too, rather grey and misty. There's some overnight rain and drizzle still lingering. Further north is a brighter start, but here it's a little bit colder with a few scattered wintry showers and a touch of frost. It is going to stay pretty grey and murky across England and Wales. Further outbreaks of rain and drizzle at times. Scotland, Northern Ireland and northern parts of Ireland, I think generally looking a little bit brighter with a few scattered showers in that northerly wind. Now it is going to turn a bit colder from the north through the day. We'll see a few of those showers in the far north turning wintry, and there's always a threat of some heavier rain at times just clipping the far south of England, but generally looking a little bit drier into the evening. Again, could see a return of some fog patches as we go through the night. Quite damp and drizzly in the south, and a more persistent band of rain pushing in from the southwest later. To the north, you'll notice things getting colder across northern Scotland. Friday's going to be a busy day for travelling, so worth bearing in mind this band of rain sweeping up from the southwest. It could be heavy at times, the wind's freshening as well. And where the rain bumps into the colder air in the north, it could be some snow, mainly over northern hills.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
We'll take a closer look in a moment at the stories that are dominating the morning's newspapers.
Sky News Snow Report, sponsored by snowrental.co.uk. Online ski hire in Europe.
After a week of largely dry weather across the Alps, things are now cooling from the north with some light to moderate snowfall. Many Austrian resorts are open with fresh snow due in the next few days. The deepest reported snow depths are around the 2-metre mark, and that's in the southern French Alps. Italy's also doing well with 85 centimetres of snow at the base of the Bardonecchia ski area, and the ski resorts in Switzerland haven't had snow for some days, but expect some fresh snow this week.
Sky News Snow Report, sponsored by snowrental.co.uk. Online ski hire in Europe.
Hello and welcome back. Let's take a look through the morning's newspapers. We've got the editor of Birmingham Live and the Birmingham Mail, Graham Brown, and the writer Benedict Spence. All right, guys, let's get straight into this then. We'll go to the front page of the Daily Mail to start with, I think. We'll start off with you, Benedict, if that is all right. And just tell us about the reporting here on the front of the Mail about petrol pricing.
Yes, this is tremendously upbeat news to go with everything else that's very positive this morning, and that is that in addition to there's train strikes across the country, there's railway companies saying that people shouldn't travel unless it's absolutely essential, and talk of potential strikes at airports causing chaos. This is the news that it's going to cost a lot more. It is currently costing a lot more simply to fill up your car. And obviously the Mail is leading on the line that it's going to make Christmas a lot more difficult. But the RAC say that the average cost of filling up on diesel is about just under £15 more expensive than it was last year, and that petrol is about £4. But the key thing here is that it's about petrol is about 7 pence more than it was this time last year per litre, and the RAC say that it should be 15 pence less. And the reason why this is the major supermarkets, the 4 major supermarkets in this country, where you can often go and fill up as you do your groceries. They are refusing to pass on drops in the average cost, the wholesale price of fuel, which are being seen at smaller independent petrol stations. So if you go to an independent one, you're more likely to save money than if you go to a supermarket. Obviously, this has a very big impact on people, but supposedly this is at least in part because supermarkets are losing money across the board on other aspects where changes in prices haven't been passed on. So food production, basically, the costs of transporting food, and all the rest of it. So it's a bit of a difficult one, really. Obviously, supermarkets need to make some profit, or at the very least keep their margins, and they are running quite tight margins as it is anyway. And it seems that where they are potentially making losses on food, they're trying to catch up on things like fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. I've noticed a difference from what it was 180 earlier this year to being about 150 now. But I guess, as the Mail said, it should get cheaper than that. All right, Graham, let's keep it moving on. We're going to go to a story inside The Guardian, and this is about Twitter. Chief Twit Elon Musk is going to stay on, even though he lost his poll as boss, until he finds a replacement.
Yeah, so I mean, Elon Musk is he's perhaps the most entertaining thing on Twitter at the moment. So yes, he put out this poll. He's very keen on allowing people to decide the future of Twitter and tell potentially they say the things that he doesn't want to hear. So he put out this poll the other day. I think 57% of people said that Elon Musk should go. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg came along later, and 83% of people apparently think that he should run Twitter. It appears like he's now relenting on his love of democracy, and he's potentially going to continue to run Twitter. And I don't know whether that's good news for Twitter, but it's good news for the entertainment of people watching it.
It certainly is entertaining. I wonder how strong that love of democracy was in the first place. Let's keep moving on, Benedict, and we're going to go to this one, which I hopefully it's going to make us smile a little bit. This is the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, who was filmed on this very channel wearing a Rolex, and now she's hit back at what she's calling inverted snobs.
Yeah, I was a bit sort of surprised by this. Everybody very eagle-eyed viewers seeing how much somebody's watch cost. Look, I mean, we all understand why this sort of thing would make the papers. You know, sort of cost of living crisis. Everybody's going to sort of leap to look at how much it is the government ministers are spending. But you know, it does seem a little unfair to jump on somebody for something that could have been purchased at any time. You know, potentially could have been inherited. I don't know what the situation is for Ms. Keegan. You know, I don't have a £10,000 watch. I'd feel very upset if people criticised me if I had a £10,000 watch and I felt that I'd worked very hard for it. You know, people should go get the bag. You know, it's very important to be able to tell time if you're a minister. Sometimes you don't have your phone. You know, you always need a backup. And, you know, OK, if it's going to cost you £10,000, that seems a little pricey, but if that is what you choose to spend your money on, well, you know, fair enough.
It's a bit expensive.
Do that.
Yeah.
And it seems better than spending it on petrol, put it that way.
Yeah, as someone who just got a new watch, I do like looking at my wrist and seeing the time rather than looking at my phone. And there's a great little pulled out quote here in the Mail, Graham, that says, "Opened many doors for me." I mean, if the watch is opening doors, that is a really cool watch.
Yeah, it's interesting actually how Mrs. Keegan's dealt with it. So she's not your usual Tory. She's very keen for people to know that she left school at 16 and went through an apprenticeship and so on. She's trying to make this a thing about inverted snobbery and about kind of working class aspiration. I think in practice what this really is that she's Education Secretary. People are asking for above inflation pay rises. History dictates that's probably not necessarily going to happen, and whether or not the optics of wearing a £10,000 Rolex at this point is necessarily the smartest thing to do.
No, perhaps not. All right, Graham, Benedict, really good to have you guys. Again, sorry that was so short. We'll have more time with you hopefully next hour. Thank you very much. Speak to you again soon.